Okay, so welcome to the OLLI at SBU lecture series. We have David Bouchier here today, and David is the resident essayist for national public radio stations in Connecticut and formerly hosted the Sunday afternoon classical music program called Sunday Matinee. David has been leading OLLI workshops for what, 7-8 years on classical music? I don't know if I have that right. Maybe it's even longer, David.
More than that, at least.
But about that. So we thank David for giving us this lecture on life in a French village. I know he's done this before, and after I saw the lecture, I wanted to move to France. So enjoy it, and thank you, David. It's all yours now.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thanks everybody for joining in this OLLI summer session. I'd like to hold questions and so on until a certain point along the way where I'll indicate. Just what I'm going to do essentially is show you a whole lot of pictures and talk about them. And I think maybe it'll be refreshing because it's been a frustrating year or 2 years for those of us who like to travel. So I thought this might make a little vicarious vacation. And it's in France. Question being, of course, first question being, why France? Well, it's a sort of personal thing. People love to find their roots these days, although it's probably not a good idea most of the time. I had a couple of aunts who looked into the genealogy of the family and came up with nothing very interesting. And my roots, as far as I have any, seem to be about 50% in France. And my name, Bouchier, if I could just switch my screen here and share something with you. Get rid of this. Here we go. The name Bouchier means butcher. And so it's highly likely that my family came from a tradition of butchers going back, I don't know how far. It's certainly true that there's never been a vegetarian in the family. And so we'll assume that that's it. No French aristocrats, no glorious past, none of those things people are looking for when they look for their roots. So I'm just as happy not to know. My family emigrated, my father's family emigrated from France in 1804, very particular year. That was the year that Napoleon declared himself emperor. If you happen to be in a country that's led by someone who declares himself emperor, it's a good idea to leave immediately. And that's what they did. No accident, really. Millions of Europeans were leaving Europe at that time. Most of them were coming to America. My ancestors were kind of sluggish and they got stuck in England. They didn't get all the way to America. And they came over. I could show you here the distance between Britain and France, as I'm sure you know, is very tiny. Let me get my pointer up. Here we are. If you look at the what the French call La Manche, but which is probably called the English Channel here, where I'm circling my pointer. It's only about the same distance as the Port Jefferson Ferry to Bridgeport. It's no distance at all. And yet, having got to England, my family, for reasons of their own, simply stayed there and lost the French connection completely, lost the language, lost everything to do with that. And it did not just lost it, but rejected it. It might have been the other side of the world. They became so thoroughly English that they really didn't want to know about France anymore. So for me, growing up in and around London and the south east of England was frustrating because it's tantalizing not to go to a place that's so close. Imagine living in Connecticut and never getting to see the wonders of Long Island, for example. It would be incredibly frustrating. And so my family didn't want to go there, didn't believe in the food, didn't believe in foreigners. And it was only when I was about 16, I finally managed to get to France and go down to Paris on an old motorcycle I'd bought. And it was so exciting, like something totally new. Riding on the wrong side of the road, eating the strange foods, trying out my schoolboy French, which turned out to be completely useless because my French teacher had been a Welshman. And it was just a wonderful experience. And like anything like that, it sort of sinks into your mind. You say, well, I want to do this again. And I've been going back to France pretty much ever since. Benjamin Franklin, of course, a great lover of France, he said, every man has two countries, his own and France, meaning maybe that we all have a real country we live in and an ideal country we dream about. The same for Thomas Jefferson. It was Thomas Jefferson's ideal country too. And of course, the connection between France and North America is very, very strong. Up to about 1803, almost half of North America was French. There's a little map here that shows it. Imagine how it would be if that had persisted. We'd be eating very different food and possibly even speaking a different language. But all of that changed. Actually, if you travel around the Midwest, you see everywhere the legacy of that French presence in the city names like Des Moines, Notre Dame, Baton Rouge, Lafayette, and so on and so on. Everywhere, French names, French names. French history is very dramatic, romantic, all those medieval kings and so on. And so France has acquired a sort of romantic.
Hi, honey. I'm online.
That's nice. France has acquired a sort of romantic aura, very strong romantic aura, almost mythical place. And about 2 million Americans go to Paris in particular every year. It's about fashion and beauty and history and food and art and literature, all those echoes of the 1920s with Stein and Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, all of that. Very romantic image. But Paris is not France, to state the absolutely obvious, any more than New York City is the United States of America. France is a very, very diverse country, at least as much as North America. And there are about 20,000 villages in the whole of France. And villages are what I really like for reasons I'll explain in a moment. And I also like the South because I like to be at least somewhat warm. So let's just go south for a moment. It always pleases me when I'm traveling down on the train, high-speed train that goes from Paris down to Marseille and so on, that one of the first signs of the South you see are these trees, cypresses. They're like a signal. You say, here's the South at last. And that idea, the South of France, almost the same glamour as Paris, but it means different things to different people. For the French themselves, what they call Le Midi is essentially a huge area south of the 45th parallel, south of Toulouse, roughly. It's a very confusing name because most of that you don't think of as the south of France. A lot of people think of the South only as the Mediterranean coast, seen in a million movies, with its gambling industry, its celebrity culture, Nice, Cannes, Menton, Monaco, and all of that. That is one aspect of the South, certainly. If we look here, we see the Mediterranean coast trending away. This is a slightly more limited view, trending away eastwards. The other south of France is usually associated with Provence. And in fact, in many people's minds, Provence is the south of France. And that's all the fault of a man called Peter Mayle, who wrote a book back in 1989, I think it was, called A Year in Provence. And it became enormously popular and spawned a whole lot of imitations. And Peter Mayle made A Year in Provence sound pretty much like A Year in Paradise, if not better. And I love these kinds of books. I call them travel pornography. They're just so much fun. And as long as you don't actually go there and check it out, they're just wonderfully informative. But there's also a third south of France, if you like, more suitable for those who can't afford incredibly costly life in Provence, and those of us who are not wealthy celebrities or film stars. And that is the area I'm going to talk about. As I said, I've been going to France with my wife for years and years and years. And typically we rented a cottage in a village, usually somewhere quite near to a city. Why a village? Well, from the touristic point of view, villages have a very attractive image. You take pictures of them, you see them on television, in travelogues and so on. In the illustrated books, there are lots and lots of books called the 100 Most Beautiful Villages in France and so on. And they're very pretty sometimes. But of course, villages are not always the ideal vacation spot for most people. They're far from the beaches, they're far from museums, the hotels, the casinos. But I've become addicted to villages because I'd lived in one in England for many, many years. And so we were always looking at villages. And not all villages are, oh, that's Peter Mayle's Minebre, not a very good picture. Not all villages are beautiful, let alone as spotlessly beautiful as this one. Some are beautiful, some are dull, some are downright nasty. I prefer the beautiful ones personally. And for me, a traditional village is a place with no more than, well, 1,500, 2,000 people at most, with no strip malls, no tower blocks, where you can walk to the countryside in a few minutes. So it's not a slice of the suburbs, it's a separate community. And they're all different. To paraphrase Tolstoy, I could say that all cities are much the same, but every village is unique, certainly has a unique culture. So this idea of villages is nostalgic, it's ridiculous, it's out of date, I know that, but it's like a taste for steam trains, which I also like. But for me, it answers the question, how should we live? What's a good way to live? The city is impossibly claustrophobic, unless you like living 40 floors up, surrounded by 10 million people. The suburbs are kind of anonymous. And the deep countryside, the real countryside, is kind of scary if you've ever tried living in it. In a village, you've got people around you, but not 10 million of them. So you can get to know them. You can get to trust them. It's not what you've seen on Midsummer Murders and Miss Marple. They don't kill people every week. I lived in a village in England for years and years and years, and there was only one single murder. And that was a very mundane domestic affair. So you're pretty safe in a village. Crime level is low, sometimes zero. And a lot of studies of happiness show that the best setting for life is like that, small, fairly cosmopolitan place where people are not suspicious of outsiders. Where places where people are suspicious are very different. And there's a phrase in French, village ouvert, village fermé, an open village or a closed village. And the closed villages are the ones where outsiders are not welcome. There are fewer and fewer of those these days. The old myth that you won't be accepted in a village until you've been there for 200 years, that's long out of date. Most villages are full of immigrants and strangers. And on the whole, a village is a good choice if you make the right choice. A pretty old stone house from the area called Languedoc, where we moved. This is Lib. Oh, that's another village in the Rhone. And this is a very famous touristy village called Les Baux in Provence, which is one of quite a number built up the hillsides and almost like fortresses. And they were fortresses for a good reason, because that whole area of France was ravaged by war for hundreds of years, religious wars mostly, Catholic versus Protestant, and also the Moorish invaders from down south and North Africa. There was war after war after war. Okay, so we were looking for a village in all of this. And the first village we landed in was something of an accident. It's pronounced Agnan, like that. And it's in the Rhone, which is an area up near Montpellier. Looks pretty, it is pretty. But we arrived there without too brilliant preparation, because somebody we knew had bought a house in the village and then suddenly was unable to use it, had to go off on an assignment to, I think it was to Stamford, and allowed us to have the house for a year for almost no rent. That's hard to resist. We hadn't seen it. We hadn't seen the village. It's a long way west of Provence towards the Spanish border. And it was a pretty basic village. In a way, it was the mirror image of Peter Mayle's Provençal fantasy. Agnan was founded in the year 777, apparently, by a wandering monk, and not much improved since, frankly. Here's the map. Get my pointer and show you where it is. Here's Montpellier, rather nice city. And Agnan was just a little over here to the west of it. Down here, of course, we have Carcassonne, Narbonne, and the Spanish border along here. So really quite close to Spain. And Spanish influence is still very much noticeable. This was the house we acquired for a year. Not quite what you expected, probably. See where those steps stick out on the left of the picture? That was one. It was one of those, the first of those. This was the street Rue de la Tour, the street of the tower. And as you see, it is built up high. Almost all of the villages there are built up high for the same reason, because of wars, and particularly in this case, because of Moorish invasions, and very narrow. You can't see it clearly here, but the street's about 8 feet wide. And that was the way the village was. It was very ancient, 777, and the core of it was unchanged. You can find very, very old maps that show it just the way it still is. Not at all cosmopolitan, working class village, mainly devoted to winemaking and drinking, of course, and politics, and playing the game of boule, but a lot of politics. There was a lot of passionate campaigning for mayor when we were there, and the village threw out the old mayor, who was a socialist, and elected a new one who was a communist. The far-right candidate got about 50 votes, but in the latest election, he got much more. So it was that kind of place, in brief. There was no tourism. We felt very much like strangers there. Let me one or two more pictures. That was a typical street. You could barely drive in most of these streets. And if you did drive into one of them, you often couldn't get back out of it again. The only real open space was in the center here by the old mill stream. And that was a problem in itself, insofar as whenever it rained in the mountains, this whole area would flood really very seriously, and everything would come to a standstill. there wasn't much in the way of shopping opportunities. That was the store, Mr. Vidal's general store. As you can see, Mr. Vidal had everything. And if he didn't have it, he would go to the next town and get it for you the next day. So it was reasonably efficient in that way, but not exactly exciting as a shopping thing. At Christmas time, when we were there, we were just wondering, what is Vidal going to do for Christmas with his window display? And what he actually did was to get a large orange beach ball and put it in the middle. That was the Christmas display. So the shopping opportunities were limited. The market was, the marketing shop there, the Petit Marché, was pretty awful, actually, especially on meats and things like that. And the market itself, the village market, which came once a week, was better, but it did only come once a week, and it was a very small market there. There was a cafe in the center, and otherwise, the main entertainment we got out of this village was the cats. If you happen to be a cat person, you'll find this amusing. If you don't happen to be a cat person, you'll find it absolutely baffling. But there were cats absolutely everywhere. This is a cat in the gutter. There are a whole lot of them that lived in the gutters. Chateau Gautier, Le Gautier. Cat up on a balcony. And the cats had created for themselves a sort of village legend, which we never found anywhere else repeated. And this was that if you didn't put 1 or 2 plastic water bottles on your front step, something bad would happen, and it would be the fault of the cats. What the cats are supposed to do, I don't know, but it was never explained. And soon after we arrived, the neighbors said, you know, you don't have any water bottles. So we got some water bottles and put them there, and every house had them. Well, I just need to mention these guys because we did acquire cats as one does. They came in the house through a place in the roof, and there were 3 of them. Monsieur Alphonse, this is Monsieur Alphonse, Monsieur Gaston, Monsieur Edouard, and they came and went. And my wife said they were all the same cat because they all look the same. But then all the cats in the village look the same. I was determined that there were 3 different cats. And Monsieur Edouard, Monsieur Gaston, the most creative of them, was the only cat I've ever met who could open a refrigerator. Literally could open it. We had to live with most of the year with a chair up against the refrigerator because of Monsieur Gaston. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But see, here's an example of water bottle outside the door. I snapped dozens of these. I'm not going to show you dozens of them. Even outside a screen door. And so there was this legend, the legend of the cats and the water bottles. And I even made it into a book in the end, a little book called The Cats and the Water Bottles and Other Mysteries of French Village Life. Okay, what else did we have? We had Radio Agnan. You see those speakers up on the church tower? They were used to broadcast the news of the village at an unpredictable time every day. The mayor would come online and a blast of music, it could be almost anything. Once it was an old Cliff Richard thing called Tutti Frutti, and it would scare the daylights out of you because it was very close to us. This was very close. And then they would make the announcements of sort of lost dogs and what was at the market today and all those kinds of thing. The church, which was a disused church, had also bells which rang 24 hours a day. So that was another thing. We could go for walks out of the village. Of course, there's beautiful countryside all around. The walks were a little bit like a walk in Ukraine, I should think, because of the hunters. There were hunters everywhere, and they would shoot anything that moved. What they were in pursuit of was the wild pig, or sanglier, this fella. But they didn't really care. And when I inquired at the mayor's office about safety, you know, and all the rest of it, he said, you know, either you should buy yourself a red hat. This was before Donald Trump's time, or you should stay home. So walking outside the village was kind of nervous making too. So that was, I'm moving along very quickly here because I want to show you more pictures of the second village, which we stayed in for longer. We stayed here in Aniane for 1 year. A very interesting year. We learned an awful lot about France, about its villages, but it was not exactly relaxing or ideal. It certainly wasn't Peter Mayle. Let me just stop the PowerPoint for a moment, see if anybody has any questions. A couple of things in the chat room here.
So David, there is one person. There's one person that made a comment. Is Liz. It Pat Ballin? Are you here?
Liz?
Pat, she said there's a Michelin.
Hold on just a second while I plug myself in.
Oh.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So one person made a comment. I think it's Pat. Pat Ballin, are you on? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
There's one of our members, Pat Ballin. She had a comment.
All right.
Pat, you have to speak up.
Can you hear me? Anybody?
Barely.
Yeah, I'm having trouble with my hearing at the moment, but yes, I can hear you.
All right. I was in Les Baux for 2 visits, different years.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a restaurant called Houstot de Beaumanière.
Mm-hmm.
Fabulous food, gorgeous service, wonderful place. And I highly recommend it. And it was hard to get to because you had to go up a big hill to get to it. It's all around, you know, hills all around the town. Mm-hmm. And, but if you're ever in that neighborhood, take my word for it. I hope it's still functioning well.
Okay, thank you. French have got a habit of putting their restaurants in impossible places. I've noticed this.
Yeah,
they don't want anybody to come and trouble them, you know.
And Irma and Saul?
What was a typical day like for you?
Well, in both villages involved a lot of walking around, you know, a lot of walking, because there wasn't much in the way of entertainment. I'll tell you a bit more about that with the next village because there was more to do there. But typical day was not exactly active. You know, we weren't being active seniors. In fact, we never active seniors. But we made the most of what there was. I'll come back to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
No more questions right now.
Okay.
Yep, you can go ahead.
Okay, let's go back. Sanglier. Poor old Sanglier, everybody's target. Trying to move on. Doesn't want to move on.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Are you able to? There you go.
Okay, here we go. So this visit to Aniane, is taking us back actually 20 years. And in the intervening time, we were still going back to France and Italy and here and there, and always with an eye open for the ideal village. Now it was beginning to be somewhat with a view to retiring there, just finding a place we could sort of stop and settle. And we'd learned from the early experience and all the different places we'd stayed, what you're looking for. Obviously, it's not rocket science. You want basic shops, good basic shops. You want a post office, very important. You want a news agents, very important, because you want to get the newspapers every day, right? The local ones and the international ones and the national ones. We used to read about 4 papers a day, which is one of the things we do. It's good to have a school in a village, because then you've got the different generations in the streets. It's not all elderly people, because in some villages, the young people just move out as first moment they get the chance. And so it's more like a retirement community than a genuine community. And you also need some activity that you can share in. And that's what we didn't really have in Anyang, because we couldn't share in the politics, we couldn't share in the bar scene, because that was totally 100% male. And we couldn't share in the bull because they wouldn't let us in. Okay, so here's the village we lit upon. We found, if you like, although it wasn't lost. It's not far from Avignon and Nîmes. Let's have that map again. Oh, okay. Let's look at this for a second. This is I'm sorry about the copyright slash across there, but you see what I mean about a real village. This is Saint-Quentin, as it's pronounced, Saint-Quentin, from the air. And you see all the way around is open countryside. Whichever way you go, you're in the countryside in 5 minutes, 10 minutes if you walk at my speed. But you know, there are no suburbs, there's no city there. I like that. I must be misanthropic. I think that's my problem. Okay, so here we are once again, back with the map and back with the pointer. Now we've moved over a little bit to the east, to the area of Nîmes, really perilously close to Avignon and Arles, where all the tourism is. But Nîmes is not a tourist town. And we're out here in the countryside to the west of Nîmes. Okay. Within a week of arriving in this village, we had a sort of brainstorm and actually bought a house. It was the bottom of the market in France, so we hit it very fortunately. And we decided we wanted a place where we could, instead of moving from village to village to village to village, where we could settle a bit. And this was the house. It was in Grande Rue, which is kind of funny. The big street. In fact, it's 8 feet wide. It was an old stone house, like the others in that row there. It's the house with the blue door, and had been built on over the years and changed until it was inside unrecognizable, but outside still looks like an old village house. This was 12 years ago. It seems kind of unadventurous to do this because most people have got this huge bucket list of where they want to go, their exotic destinations. But we'd done quite a lot of that and decided maybe a little bit of quiet time would be good. So this was a possibility for retirement. We weren't committed to anything, but we were committed to the house. We were interested in the history of it, obviously. People who'd lived there, but it's very hard to find out anything much because there's no documentation with these old houses. They've been built on, built over, renovated for hundreds of years. And if you look at the stone vaulting in the lower part, somebody who was an expert said this takes it back to the early 1700s, possibly earlier than that. So if that's the case, then the old house has seen, it wasn't like those old houses on television. It's seen a lot of history, you know, in France, 8 kings, the French Revolution, 2 emperors, 2 world wars, 5 republics. You know, a lot had gone on in the lifetime of this house. These old buildings are constantly renovated. Somebody had started renovation on this one and then abandoned it. We carried on with the renovation with the help of our handyman called Pascal. I think we hired him because of his name, because it's sort of reassuring to have the services of somebody named after the French mathematician, moralist Blaise Pascal, because Pascal was all about thinking. And he was a wonderful handyman, with the exception of the fact he never had any tools. And you would have to provide him with tools. Well, I had to, in the end, have a whole handyman's selection of tools. And he would come in and say he wanted a saw, he wanted this, he wanted that. Apart from that, he was fine. Quite a young man. And so the renovations were eventually transformed the inside of the house from an old stone house to something quite respectable. You can see it's a kitchen, living room here. We took the roof off one part of the building and made it into a terrace. You can see this used to be a room, but it became an open terrace, which was very nice, and gave us a sort of outdoor, not exactly a view, but an outdoor place to sit. And there was even a place to work, although I didn't do much of that, as you can probably imagine. So it was a very attractive little house. And we found very quickly, well, we'd already found that Saint-Quentin had all the things that we really wanted, had all the things that Diane had: winemaking, politics, cafe life, cats. Plus, it had a small library. It had 2 big weekly markets, a school, very important, as I said. And about the only thing it didn't have was parking. And because of the narrow streets, as you'll see, we had eventually to hire, well, what it actually was Madame Florentin's cowshed. She was an old lady who lived close by, and she'd been married to a farmer who'd long gone, and she had a cowshed at the back of her house, and she would rent it out to people who, like us, who couldn't manage to park their cars, and for a small fee every week. And so that was where the car lived, in Madame Florentin's cowshed. And it was disused, by the way. We didn't have to displace any cows to get it in there. And in order to get there, we had to go to the end of the village and drive through the farm, basically, and get back to the cowshed. So we had parking. Public life in the village is mostly outdoors, mainly because of the weather, and because you have to walk, and because most of the time you can't use your car. The streets are too narrow, you can't park anyway. You can see a car poking its nose into the end of the street here by the charcuterie. That's typical. In a moment, what's going to happen to that car? I can tell you, he's going to meet head on another car coming the other way. And one of them is going to have to back all the way down. It just was not built for cars. And outside the village, there were big signs saying, don't come into the village with your car, park in the parking lots. No, people wouldn't do it. Tourists especially would never do it. They'd always have to come in with their cars. And the big SUVs would sometimes get literally stuck, on the corners or in the very narrow places, which entertained everybody, of course. So there was a lot of walking, and therefore was a lot of mutual recognition, because you would see the same people every day. If you went to the newsagents every day, you would see the same people. If you went to the charcuterie every day, ditto. So in the end, they begin to recognize you. When they begin to recognize you, you say, hello, bonjour, monsieur. You don't need to know who they are. And so in the end, you get an awful lot of handshakes in the course of a single morning's walk, which is rather nice. And it makes you, in a way, part of the place, in a way that we weren't in Anian. Let's take a walk around the village here. Another narrow street. See, the center of the street has been made rather more beautiful by a kind of tiled guttering. It's very attractive. What people do in these old villages where the predominant tone is grey, grey stone and grey concrete, they put colour wherever they can. That just brightens it up. This is the biggest street in the village. It was a later street built up when a hotel was added at the top of the hill. So this was our, as it were, Long Island Expressway. It's very short, actually. The little street close by our house. That blue, that pale blue, was almost a village traditional color. Almost everything was painted in it, including our front door. And you could buy it at the local grocery store, the paint, that is. It's a rather attractive Mediterranean color. I found that quite a lot of villages have a sort of typical color that they have right throughout the village. This is one of the old alleyways leading up. This gives you something, I don't know if you can see this, but something that was totally missing from the village because it hadn't been there for about 400 years was a chateau. If you went right up to the top of the village, you'll find a ring of great old stones. And that was all that was left. Been thrown down sometime in the 1300s, I don't know. Nobody seemed to really be clear when the chateau had gone. But when it went, it became a stone mine for the whole village. And so lots of villages are built out of these huge old, chateau blocks of stone, blocks of granite. And you find bits and pieces all over the place. You see on this wall here, there's a little gargoyle. Must have come from the chateau. Over here, there's a couple of columns, like Doric columns, that must have come from the chateau. And this was one of the alleyways leading up. There were 3 of them at different levels of the villages going up, up, up. And eventually you would get to the chateau, where presumably they would pour boiling oil on you and you would go back down again. So the chateau was an important, as it were, invisible feature of the village. It had gone, but its stones were everywhere. Another nicely colored picture. Believe it or not, there was a bookbinder in the village, a very fine bookbinder. Another one. It's a pretty little street. Where people could, they would grow various kinds of bushy plants into the street, which made the streets even narrower. And rooftops. I mean, I always like rooftops anyway, because they just show the sort of variety of a place and how it grew. They have a very specific purpose. I love those old, Provençal tiles too. They have a very specific purpose in keeping the rain off, because the storms in that part of the country are quite fierce when they come. We're between the Cevennes Mountains on the one hand and the Mediterranean on the other. And when the warm air from one met the warm air from another, you get these tremendous thunderstorms, tremendous. And you wouldn't think a roof could stand it. But these roofs could, because they're built for that. And of course, cats. But this is, you can see here, this is the Gumby cat, was another of our acquisitions. You can see here how thick and heavy these tiles are. They are really heavy. It takes a big wind to blow them off, although it does happen. And wind is another of those characteristics of this part of the country. You get a lot of wind, and they vary. There's the Mistral. Everybody's heard of the Mistral. It's a cold wind from the northwest. There's the Tramontane. There's the Sirocco, a hot wind from Africa. There's the Levantine, which comes from the east. Sometimes they all seem to blow at once, but there's a lot of wind. And each of them brings a different climate and even a different set of smells. The Sirocco actually brought the smell of Africa, quite literally. And the dust sometimes too, which might raise us the question, what's the weather like? Not quite what you might imagine if you hadn't been there. Whenever you see the south of France in pictures or film or in television, it's always beautiful blue sky and warm weather and everybody wearing almost no clothes. No, they have a climate, they have seasons, and the winter can be quite dull, wet and windy. It's by no means sunshine all the way. Even right down on the south coast, in Morocco and so on, it's by no means a sort of continuous paradise of warm and sunny weather. That's just a part of the summer. So that's something you have to get used to. You also have to get used to the fact that the French haven't got used to it. And so they don't really prepare in terms of the heating and cooling of the house. We had, in summer, of course, it can get really, really hot. We eventually got Pascal to install for us a heat exchanger. It's one of those gadgets that can blow both hot and cold. And I didn't believe in it. It was not, heat exchangers were not part of my religion, but it worked beautifully. It actually did just about cope with the extremes of climate. Okay, enough of weather. Oh, another cat. Sorry about the cats. Apologies, another cat. Market, huge events, Tuesday and Friday. They move from village to village, of course. And the market here had a huge, I've never seen such a spectacular fish stall and just about everything else that you could think of. I'll show you in a moment the area it covered. Here we are, now you can see it. You see the whole thing, it looks like a riot taking place, but it's the market taking place. This market cover is very important because of the sunshine and the rain. When it rained, all the stores wanted to get under this cover here. It's really ugly, as you see, but very practical. And it has this historic interest because it was built by a certain Joseph Monnier, who was a son of this village of Saint-Quentin. And Joseph Monnier, you'll be stunned to hear, was the inventor of reinforced concrete. So whenever you see a reinforced concrete building, Joseph Monnier is responsible. This is back in the 1800s. And this was built much later than that, but built in sort of almost in honor as a kind of monument to Joseph Monnier, the marketplace. Very good. Market was a great place to get to know people. You got to know people that you were always there. They saw you were there. They saw you were buying things, which meant that you were probably not a tourist. And you also got to know the people who worked on the stalls. I got to know the important ones, the cheese lady, the egg man, the two bakers, the wine man, of course, charcuterie man. All of these people, became a sort of characters in an ongoing soap opera of living in a French village. And yet they were an essential part of it, a real part of the experience. And we needed them because we needed all those things. What else could we do? Well, every village has got the special identity based on its history. And what Saint-Quentin had was a very lively art scene, and particularly a pottery scene. Going back hundreds of years, apparently a long time ago, it was famous for its making of pottery pipes. But in the 1960s, a very intelligent mayor woman had decided that they could turn this into something and make it into a pottery village. And she advertised all over Europe for potters and ceramic artists to come and live in the village and, have special rents and so on, and sell their stuff and have exhibitions, whatever. And it was a huge success. Potters came from all over Europe, and right now there are about 25 active potteries around the village. And people come from all over Europe just to buy the stuff. Well, this was something we could sort of connect to because although I'm not artistic at all, my wife is, and she knows about these things. So we decided to make over the space under the house, which was useless as a garage because you couldn't turn a car into it, it was too narrow, into a sort of pottery showroom. Okay, these are one or two of the pottery related images. This was the largest pottery in the village, Pottery Danushka. Still not very big. It's a tiny little pottery just almost next door to us, Pottery Natalie. They even had their own cafe called Café des Potiers, with its own menu. And this is basically what we did with the space under the house. We had Pascal, poor old Pascal, cleaned it all out and cleaned it up, excuse me. And we installed a few simple lights and invited people to come and exhibit there for a period of time, usually a week or two. And this was the big exhibition of the year, Terala. So every few weeks there would be a new person in the basement, as it were, with a new kind of pottery, and that was very charming. We got to know these people. They came from all over. We had Belgians, Germans, and we got to know them, and we got to learn a bit about their pottery, and we got to meet a few more potters outside. This was a German, Kurt, one of our German potters came. He's a very jolly fella. This is my wife sitting for a potter who was, this was a very interesting one. I think it was the first one we had. And he called himself a confrontational potter. And his idea was the pottery should disgust people. And all of his pottery was very, very disgusting in various ways. It was always bits of human bodies or things that were more or less blasphemous. It was horrible. He didn't sell anything, but that was his thing. He was quite famous for it in Belgium. So we had this as an entertainment. It's Natalie, our neighbor. And all of this sort of coordinated by the mayor. And mayors in French villages have far more powers than anything you see here. France is very centralized in many ways, but in terms of villages, it's very decentralized. So when we wanted to open our car as a kind of a gallery, we thought, oh, we're going to have to fill in all kinds of those French bureaucratic forms. No, we just went to see Mayor Bonzi, and he said, fine, do what you like. And he came along to the opening and introduced us to all kinds of people. He was that kind of guy, a real local fella, always pushing for the good of the village. So we, by the way, he wasn't just a solitary ruler. He wasn't a solitary dictator in the village. He had his senate. These are senators who used to sit outside the bar, or more often inside it, and they would collect all the information, all the gossip, all the bad news from around the community, and then Bonzi would come and join them, and he would pick it all up from them. He didn't need a network of informants. He didn't need a huge Capitol building. He had the senators, a miserable bunch actually, but those were people to know. We tried to cultivate people like that. You know, it was very difficult sometimes, but the restaurant owner, it's very important. The owners of the Maison de la Presse, the newspaper shop, the two cat rescue ladies, there were two of them, we need to get to know those. And we had a wealthy Parisian neighbor called Francoise who introduced us to all kinds of people. So that was it, you know, we got to be integrated by way of the art. and by way of, just getting to know these key people in the village. And that was so much easier to do in a cosmopolitan village like Saint-Quentin than it was in the other. Other amusements in the village, the annual, excuse me, Fête Votive, as it's called, which is really a bull running exhibition. Stupid thing, I really disapprove of it. But this travels around the villages every summer, and they bring young bulls from the farms out in the Camargue and release them in the streets, and deeply stupid young men try to catch them and wrestle them. It's one of the silliest and most dangerous things I've ever seen. And it's all so the young men can show off. It's got no other purpose whatsoever. It's also very cruel to the animals. So there was the annual Fête Votive, which turned the village upside down for about 3 or 4 days. We won't talk about getting cars because that's a bit of a nightmare. I don't mention this. French government has been trying to cut down on its generous retirement benefits for a long time. A lot of people could retire at 55, 60. 60 is a sort of baseline. And the French government simply doesn't want to continue this. But what they don't realize is that there's a lot of secondary benefits. You've got a huge number of retired people who are doing useful things in their own way. And this rather silly story about our front door illustrates. We had a door, this is not ours, this is another door, but we had a door with a number on it just like this. And the postman knocked on the door and said, "Your number is not good enough. A number is in the wrong place, it's the wrong color." Okay, so we had to find out the right place and the right color. So we got a little ceramic plaque about 6 or 7 inches square. And I put it up on the door, like the one on this door here. Neighbors came round right away and said, "You can't put it there. You have to put it up top. Otherwise somebody will steal it." And then the next neighbor came and said, no, you need to put it to the side where the postman can see it. This was all stupid because the postman knows exactly where the house is. It's a tiny little village. And more of these old men kept turning up, suggesting where the plaque should be. And finally, they gathered their tools and they decided they were going to put it on the side. Quite difficult because it's granite to drill into. And so they came one after the other and they drilled and they banged and they made the holes bigger and they made the holes smaller. And at the end of the day, we had our door number up, slightly askew and chipped. And 3 or 4 old men enjoyed themselves for 2 days. That's the benefit of early retirement, you see. Otherwise, I would have had to do it myself. I think that's about all I have time for, except just to click on here. We did have dormice in the walls at one point, and I have to tell you, they weren't at all like the dormouse in Alice in Wonderland, who was a very funny dormouse. They were very noisy dormice. We got rid of them. We had mice, of course. I had to trap them, live trap them, and I would take them up to the church, disused church, slide them under the door. So there must be colonies in there. And yes, I think those are the main things. I'll mention the nearby town because we weren't isolated here totally. 4 kilometers. Oh, yeah, let me show you these. I've still got time for this. All postcards. Not much changes. 1890s and today, essentially the same buildings. Place de l'Horloge, a clock tower. Our own street, Grand Rue, scarcely changed since the 1890s. Place du Monument. And the nearby town I was just mentioning, Uzès, 4 kilometers away. Again, just about the size of town you want. Ducal Palace, as you can see, still inhabited. See the Duke's flag flying on the top there. It's been a home of the Dukes of France since 1088. And the Duke, Jacques de Crussol, will still take you on a tour, but only if you pay him. But you can tour the palace. A very nice old medieval town. A reasonable number of shops, a nice library, just a very good thing to have a few kilometers away. You don't want to be quite in the absolute depths of the countryside. Okay, I think we're up against our time. I'm going to just come back. Here's Liz. Liz, that's a nice picture.
Oh, thanks. We do have some questions. I didn't know if everybody wanted you to continue. I don't know if they had enough time, but we'll go through some questions. We have somebody mentioned, how about healthcare? Terry? Did you want to elaborate on that, Terry Germain? Are you still on, Terry? She was asking about healthcare. Yeah, she might have gone already, but was there healthcare, I guess, in the area? Can you hear me, David?
Just, yes.
Somebody asked about healthcare. Was there healthcare in the area?
I'm sorry, say it again. This is so.
That's okay. Was there healthcare in the area?
Hospital?
Healthcare, yeah.
Oh, healthcare. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's so important. There was a small group of doctors and dentists and so on right in the village, and you could go to them. But of course, in France, if you're not part of the system, if you don't have the vital carte vitale, you're in trouble. The doctor could choose to take you or not, and sometimes it's not if they're busy. So it's terribly important to have some kind of backup insurance or some sort of cover for yourself, or to be healthy, of course. I did have a bad fall in the village once, and I was patched up by the pharmacist, and who didn't charge me, I have to say. And the only time I had to go to the dentist, he didn't charge me either. But that was because they didn't have any way of doing it. They just don't have any way of taking money. It's not in their system.
Wow.
But you really need to be careful of healthcare.
Irma has a question, and Sal.
Well, actually, we had two questions.
Okay.
One of them was, did you ever discuss politics with the people, and how did they feel about America? And the other question was, there was a bell tower. There was a little bell up at the top of it, looked like an old Renaissance tower. Did they use that to warn the people of fires and things?
I'm not sure about that second one. As far as politics goes, no. It's not a good idea, because you don't know who's what. And there are divisions in every village. Many of the divisions are between who was on whose side in the Second World War, who supported the Nazis and who didn't. That's still alive and well, including their parents. And the only time you could tell this is when Armistice Day comes around, and a good part of the village just disappears, doesn't participate in Armistice Day. So there are things like that to stay really clear of.
Thank you.
Yeah. So careful. And let's see.
Okay, so Cynthia. Go ahead.
Sorry. Delivery of furniture.
Yeah.
It gets delivered with great difficulty, actually. The only large thing we had to have delivered, we had to have the window taken out, and it was hoisted up on one of those sort of cherry picker trucks and pushed through the window. So in the old houses, it's quite tricky. And it's better to buy small things like occasional tables, really.
You also mentioned that the streets were so narrow. Could a truck get down the streets?
No, most big trucks wouldn't fit, and that was a problem everywhere. The people who had oil heating had to have a special truck with a very long hose to fill up the tank.
So but I'm still very, very curious. At some point, you know, a family needs to buy a new bed or whatever, maybe once every 60 years.
Mhm.
A refrigerator, well, that's, you get smaller stuff. I used to live in Paris. But anyway, it's, at some points, I guess they would just have men carry the couch or the bed down the narrow street, like walk it down.
Yeah.
Well, you might not have seen this actually happen, so that's okay.
No, I haven't actually seen it, but okay. Let me see. I think I need to finish now, Liz.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Nothing else important.
There was just one, they asked if the market was open all year or just spring and fall.
All year. All year.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, thank
goodness.
you. Thank you, David. I know you have to get out of here, but thank you for giving us this wonderful lecture, and thank you all for participating.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.